I watched my entire family break into my brand new house and throw themselves a private party. They left, ate my food, mocked the rich stranger who owned the place, and even joked about taking a few expensive things before leaving. The only problem was they had no idea that I was the owner, and I was standing outside with the keys in my hand. My name is Corinne Ashford, and for as long as I can remember, I was never the favorite child. I was the one everyone called when they needed help, but somehow I was forgotten whenever there was something to celebrate. My parents, Marlo and Dean Ashford, always gave more attention to my younger brother, Rhett, and my younger sister, Tegan. If they did something small, my parents acted like it was a huge achievement. When I worked hard or reached a goal, they barely noticed. As I got older, nothing really changed. I was expected to solve problems, lend money when someone was short, and help with family responsibilities. Most of the time, nobody even thanked me. They simply expected me to say yes because that was the role they had given me. After years of living that way, I stopped waiting for their approval. Instead, I focused on building my own future. I started a small consulting business. It wasn't easy at first, and I worked long hours while keeping my personal life private. Little by little, the business grew into something successful. I never told my family how well I was doing because I knew they would either ask me for money or find a way to make my success about themselves. When I finally had enough savings, I bought my dream home. It was a beautiful modern house in a quiet neighborhood. To keep my family from finding out, I bought it through an LLC, so my name wouldn't appear in public records. Only my lawyer and a few trusted people knew the truth. The house still needed a few finishing touches before I could move in. Every day, I imagined the peaceful life I would finally have there. For the first time, I would have a place where nobody could use me, criticize me, or walk all over me. I thought that house would become my safe place. I had no idea that before I even unpacked my first box, my own family was about to turn it into the biggest betrayal of my life. From an early age, I understood that my place in the family was different from everyone else's. I wasn't the child people praised or worried about. I was the one they counted on whenever something went wrong. If an errand needed to be done or someone needed help, my name was always the first one mentioned. After a while, it became normal to put my own plans aside without anyone asking how I felt about it. When I started earning money, I tried to save for my future. I had small dreams like taking classes, traveling, or buying a reliable car. Somehow those plans were always delayed. If my parents had an unexpected expense or one of my siblings needed help, my savings disappeared. They always promised things would get better, but they never did. I kept believing that one day they would remember everything I had done for them. Family celebrations were another reminder of where I stood. I arrived early, helped prepare meals, arranged decorations, greeted guests, and cleaned after everyone left. Tegan and Rhett were always surrounded by compliments and gifts. My parents smiled proudly beside them while I stayed busy making sure everything went smoothly. Nobody asked me to join the family photos until the very end, and sometimes they forgot altogether. As the years passed, I stopped expecting anything different. I focused on my career instead. Building my consulting business took patience, long hours, and many sleepless nights. I handled difficult clients, learned from mistakes, and slowly earned a good reputation. Every success came from my own effort, but I kept those victories to myself. I never mentioned new contracts, bigger projects, or the money I was making. My parents still believed I was barely getting by. Whenever they called, it was because they wanted something. Sometimes they needed money for repairs. Other times they wanted me to solve problems that Rhett or Tegan had created. They never asked if I was busy or whether helping would cause problems for me. It was simply expected that I would figure everything out. I noticed something else over time. Whenever I shared even a small piece of good news, the conversation quickly changed. Either my achievement was ignored, or someone found a way to compare it to one of my siblings. After enough moments like that, staying quiet felt easier than trying to explain my life. That was when I made a decision. My future would belong to me alone. I stopped discussing my business, my savings, and my plans with anyone in the family. The less they knew, the more peaceful my life became. They continued believing I was the same quiet daughter they had always overlooked, and I let them believe it. I had finally learned that not every success needed to be shared, especially with people who had never truly wanted to see me succeed. After deciding to keep my personal life private, I became even more careful with every major decision I made. Buying a house wasn't something I rushed into. Every weekend, I visited different neighborhoods, drove through quiet streets, and looked at more homes than I could count. Some were too crowded, while others never felt right. I wasn't looking for the biggest house. I wanted a place where I could finally feel comfortable the moment I walked through the front door. The house I chose felt different from the start. It sat on a peaceful street lined with tall trees, far enough from the busy parts of the city to feel calm but close enough to my office. Large windows filled the rooms with natural light, and the backyard was exactly the kind of space I had always imagined enjoying with a morning cup of coffee. For the first time in years, I felt excited about something that belonged only to me. The purchase was handled carefully. My attorney managed all the paperwork, and the property was bought through an LLC. It wasn't about hiding from strangers. It was about protecting myself from people who believed they had a right to every part of my life. I didn't tell my parents, my siblings, or any relatives. There was nothing for them to celebrate because they didn't even know it had happened. The house needed a few updates before I moved in. I hired trusted contractors to repaint the walls, replace old flooring, and install better lighting. Every few days, I stopped by to check the progress. I took my time choosing furniture because I wanted every room to feel warm and welcoming instead of rushed. It was the first home I had ever owned, and I wanted it to reflect the quiet life I had worked so hard to build. Standing inside those empty rooms, I often pictured what life would be like after everything was finished. I imagined reading in the living room on rainy evenings, cooking dinner without interruptions, and waking up every morning knowing nobody could suddenly appear asking for money or favors. That feeling of peace meant more to me than the house itself. While I was busy planning my future, something was happening that I knew nothing about. One afternoon, my cousin Nolan drove past the property while visiting a friend nearby. He noticed the moving trucks, construction vehicles, and workers coming and going. Since the house still looked empty most evenings, he assumed nobody had moved in yet. Instead of forgetting about it, Nolan mentioned the place during a family dinner. He joked that it would be the perfect location for a private celebration because it looked expensive, quiet, and completely unoccupied. Everyone laughed, and before long, the conversation turned into a real plan. None of them stopped to wonder who actually owned the house. And none of them imagined that the owner was sitting only a few miles away, already counting the days until she could finally call it home. The final inspection was scheduled for the next morning, so I left town for an overnight business meeting without any worries. The contractors only had a few small jobs left to finish before handing everything over. I expected to return the following afternoon, collect the keys, and begin moving my belongings in over the weekend. That evening, my relatives gathered a few streets away before heading to the house together. Nolan acted as if he had everything under control. He told everyone the workers were gone for the day and that nobody would come back until morning. Since one of the construction entrances had been left unlocked for the crew, they slipped inside without much effort. At first, they treated it like some harmless adventure. They carried in folding tables, food trays, coolers, balloons, and decorations. Music started playing through a portable speaker, and before long the empty house was filled with laughter and conversation. They admired the large kitchen, wandered through the bedrooms, and joked about what it must be like to have enough money to own a place like that. Nobody seemed worried about getting caught. My father looked around and said the owner was probably some rich investor with several properties who would never notice a few hours of visitors. My mother laughed and agreed that people with houses this expensive barely spent time in them anyway. Hearing that later would bother me more than I expected. As the night went on, the conversations became more personal. Somehow my name came up even though I wasn't there. Rhett laughed and said I was probably sitting alone in my small apartment, working late like always. Tegan shook her head and said I cared too much about work because I had nothing else going for me. A few cousins joined in, saying I had always been too serious to enjoy life. Then someone looked around the beautiful living room and joked that if I ever saw a house like this, I would probably ask for a tour because I could never afford one myself. Everyone laughed without thinking twice. They spoke as if they knew exactly what my life looked like, even though none of them had bothered to ask me in years. While they enjoyed themselves, some people began opening cabinets and looking through storage spaces out of curiosity. Others tested light switches, opened drawers, and wandered into rooms that were clearly not meant for guests. They treated the place like it belonged to no one. What none of them realized was that the security system had already been activated. Small cameras quietly recorded every room, every careless step, and every word spoken inside the house. They believed they were alone, completely unaware that every moment of the evening was being saved. My meeting ended earlier than expected, and I started the drive home just after sunset. I was looking forward to seeing the finished house for the first time. About halfway through the trip, my phone buzzed with a security notification. At first, I didn't think much of it. The contractors sometimes worked later than planned, so I assumed someone had forgotten to turn off the motion sensors. A minute later, another alert appeared. Then another. I pulled into a quiet parking area and opened the security app. The first camera showed my front entry. People were walking in and out with plates of food and drinks. I switched to the living room camera, and my heart dropped. My parents were sitting on my new furniture as if they owned the place. Rhett was laughing with a group of cousins. Tegan was showing people around the kitchen like she had lived there for years. For a few seconds, I couldn't even think. I simply stared at the screen, trying to understand how they had found the house. I checked another camera. Nolan was telling a story while everyone laughed. Then he smiled and said, "At least we picked the right house." Imagine doing this somewhere people actually live. More laughter filled the room. I should have been furious, but instead I stayed completely quiet. I realized that nobody there knew they were being recorded. If I rushed over immediately, they would simply make excuses. If I watched, they would tell me exactly who they really were. So I kept listening. The conversation slowly changed. My mother sighed and said she wished Corinne would stop acting so independent because it made asking for help more difficult. My father answered that I had always been useful whenever the family needed something. He said I never complained enough to become a real problem. Rhett leaned back in his chair and laughed. "She's predictable. If we ever get stuck, she'll figure it out. She always does." Tegan nodded without hesitation. "That's why nobody worries about her. She'll always be there." Nobody questioned those words. They simply accepted them as fact. A little later, one of my aunts admitted she only called me before holidays because she knew I would help organize everything. Another cousin laughed and said I was the only person in the family who worked hard without expecting attention in return. Instead of sounding grateful, he sounded amused, as though my kindness had always been something to take advantage of. Then came the sentence that stayed with me the longest. Nolan shrugged and said, "Corinne was never going anywhere big anyway. She's comfortable being the responsible one." Several people agreed without even looking up from their food. I felt something inside me finally become still. Not because the words surprised me, but because they confirmed everything I had quietly suspected for years. I started saving copies of every camera recording to a secure folder. Every conversation, every careless comment, every laugh, and every face was preserved. I didn't interrupt them. I didn't call anyone. I simply gathered the truth they had chosen to reveal on their own. By the time I reached the city, I wasn't driving home as the forgotten daughter anymore. I was driving toward a house that belonged to me, carrying proof that would change every relationship I had ever tried to hold together. I stayed in my car a little longer instead of driving straight to the house. I parked a few blocks away where nobody would notice me and kept watching the live camera feeds. I wanted to believe I had already heard the worst, but the night was far from over. People became more comfortable as the hours passed. They stopped choosing their words carefully because they believed no outsider was listening. The conversations turned into stories from years ago, stories I had never heard before. My mother picked up an old family photo that had been sitting in one of the moving boxes waiting to be unpacked. She smiled for a moment before placing it back down. Then she quietly said that I had always been the easiest child to ignore because I never caused trouble. My father answered that spending more time and money on Tegan and Rhett had simply made more sense. According to him, I would always find a way to take care of myself. Nobody argued with him. Instead, an uncle nodded and said that was exactly why the family depended on me so much. He laughed and said people like me were useful because we never expected anything back. Those words hurt more than I expected. They weren't spoken with anger. They were spoken as though they were completely normal. A few minutes later, another conversation caught my attention. One of my older cousins mentioned a management position that had opened several years earlier at a company where his friend worked. I remembered applying for that job and never receiving an interview. He casually admitted that he had told his friend I wasn't interested anymore. Instead, he recommended Rhett for another opportunity through the same business circle because he thought Rhett needed a break more than I did. Someone asked if I had ever found out. He laughed and shook his head. "No. She probably thinks they picked someone else." The room filled with quiet chuckles before everyone moved on to another topic, as if they had been discussing the weather. I looked away from the screen for a moment. Suddenly, things that had never made sense in my past finally had an explanation. Inside the house, people had become even less careful. They opened kitchen cabinets looking for glasses instead of using the disposable cups they had brought. Someone unwrapped new blankets that were still in their packaging because they wanted to sit outside where it was cooler. Two cousins walked through the guest rooms, talking about which decorations would look better in their own homes. One of them picked up a decorative bowl and joked that nobody would notice if it disappeared. Another agreed and suggested taking a couple of small items before leaving. That was enough. I quietly saved those video clips along with everything else. Every minute added another piece to a picture I could no longer ignore. For years, I believed distance had grown between us because life became busy. That night showed me something very different. The distance had been there all along. I just hadn't wanted to see it. The cameras didn't create the truth. They simply captured what my family revealed when they believed I would never be watching. I called my attorney before I did anything else. I explained what had happened and told him I had clear video recordings of everyone inside the house. He listened without interrupting, then advised me not to confront anyone alone. He contacted the local police department, explained the situation, and arranged for an officer to stay nearby in case things got out of hand. By the time I reached the neighborhood, the party was still going. Music drifted through the windows, and several cars were parked along the street. I could see people laughing through the front windows as if they belonged there. The police officer met me a short distance from the driveway. He told me they would stay outside unless I asked for help or someone refused to leave. My attorney arrived a few minutes later carrying copies of the property records and the closing documents. He looked at me and quietly asked if I was ready. I nodded. We walked toward the front door together. I slipped my key into the lock and turned it. The conversation inside continued for another second before the door slowly opened. As soon as I stepped into the entryway, the smart home system recognized my access code. "Welcome home, Corinne," the calm voice said through the speakers. The room fell completely silent. Every face turned toward me. For a moment, nobody moved. My parents looked confused. Tegan frowned as if she couldn't understand why I was there. Rhett glanced toward the hallway, probably expecting someone else to appear. Nolan forced a nervous smile. "Oh, you must be working for the owner," he said. "We were just leaving." I didn't answer. Instead, I walked past everyone without raising my voice. My attorney followed behind me and placed a folder on the kitchen island. I opened it and laid out the closing papers, the property records, and the deed. "I don't work for the owner," I said calmly. "I am the owner." Nobody spoke. My mother stared at the documents before looking back at me. She shook her head slowly as if she expected someone to tell her it was a joke. My father picked up one of the papers with shaking hands. His eyes moved across the page until he reached my name. His face lost all color. Tegan stepped closer and whispered, "This can't be right." "It is," my attorney replied before I had to. The silence became heavier than any argument could have been. People slowly looked around the house again, but this time everything felt different. The walls, the furniture, the boxes waiting to be unpacked, none of it belonged to a stranger anymore. It belonged to the person they had spent the entire evening laughing at. I looked around the room at every familiar face. "You spent hours talking about me," I said quietly. "You insulted me, searched through my things, opened boxes that weren't yours, and planned to take items home. You believed nobody would ever know." No one tried to deny it. The cameras mounted near the ceiling suddenly caught everyone's attention. One by one, they looked up at them. Only then did they realize that the entire night had been recorded from beginning to end. The confidence they had walked in with disappeared, replaced by the fear of knowing there was no way to erase what they had done. The silence didn't last long. As soon as everyone understood they had been caught, the room filled with nervous voices. People who had been laughing only minutes earlier suddenly started talking over one another. Each person seemed more interested in protecting themselves than telling the truth. Nolan pointed toward another cousin and claimed the whole idea had never been his. The cousin immediately denied it and said everyone had agreed to come. Someone else insisted they thought the house belonged to a family friend. The stories changed from one person to the next, and none of them matched. My father stepped forward with his hands raised. He tried to sound calm and reasonable. "Corinne, you've got this all wrong," he said. "We only came to make sure everything was okay. We noticed the house looked empty and thought someone should check on it." Before I could answer, my mother quickly agreed with him. She nodded several times and said they had only stayed because everyone else arrived. She acted as though she had no choice in the matter. I looked at both of them without saying a word. Then I picked up my tablet from the kitchen counter. With a few taps, I connected it to the television mounted on the living room wall. The first video began to play. It showed everyone carrying food, drinks, and decorations through the front entrance. No one looked confused or worried. They were smiling and laughing from the moment they walked inside. Nobody spoke while the recording played. When it ended, I started another clip. This time, Nolan proudly explained why he believed the owner would never find out. Every sentence he had spoken earlier filled the room again. His shoulders dropped. He knew there was nothing he could say. I played another recording. It showed my father joking that wealthy owners rarely noticed what happened inside houses they didn't live in. My mother's laughter followed only seconds later. Neither of them looked at the screen. Their eyes stayed fixed on the floor. One recording led to another. Tegan's comments. Rhett's jokes. The conversation about my career. The discussion about taking things from the house. Every excuse they had offered disappeared as soon as their own voices filled the room. Nobody argued anymore because there was nothing left to argue about. I never raised my voice. I didn't need to. The recording spoke more clearly than I ever could. When the last video ended, I turned off the television. The room became quiet again. For the first time in many years, nobody interrupted me, corrected me, or dismissed my feelings. They simply stood there, surrounded by the truth they had created themselves. Not one person could blame misunderstanding, bad memory, or someone else's words. Everything had been preserved exactly as it happened. And for once, I wasn't asking anyone to believe me. The evidence had already done that for me. Nobody stayed very long after that. One by one, they quietly collected their coats and bags and walked toward the front door. The officer waiting outside made sure everyone left without causing more trouble. No one tried to argue anymore. They understood the situation had gone too far to fix with another excuse. When the house was finally empty, I walked from room to room with my attorney. We took photographs of everything that had been damaged or disturbed. Some walls were marked, a few pieces of furniture had been scratched, unopened boxes had been torn open, and several new items were missing from where I had left them. None of the damage was impossible to repair, but that wasn't the point. My home had been treated like it had no owner, and that mattered. Over the next few days, my attorney handled the paperwork. Claims were filed against the relatives who had entered the property without permission and against those responsible for the damage. Every repair, every missing item, and every cleaning cost was carefully listed. I wasn't asking for anything extra. I only wanted them to be responsible for what they had done. The phone calls started almost immediately. Some relatives asked me to drop everything because we were family. Others claimed the legal process was unnecessary and would only embarrass everyone. A few tried to make me feel guilty by saying my parents were under a lot of stress. I listened politely, but my answer never changed. This isn't about embarrassment, I said. It's about responsibility. After that, I stopped answering most of their calls. I also made another decision that had nothing to do with the court. I closed every door they had kept open only because it benefited them. I would no longer lend money, pay unexpected bills, solve problems, or rescue anyone from situations they created themselves. Those years were over. Without someone constantly fixing everything, cracks inside the family began to appear. I heard through other relatives that arguments broke out over who should pay for the damages. Nolan blamed everyone else for following his suggestion. My parents argued with him, while Red insisted none of it would have happened if someone had simply checked who owned the house first. The people who had always stood together suddenly couldn't agree on anything. For the first time, I wasn't standing in the middle trying to keep everyone happy. I stayed focused on my own life while the legal process moved forward. My attorney kept me informed, but I no longer felt the need to follow every detail. I had already heard everything I needed to hear that night. I thought revenge would feel loud, dramatic, or exciting. Instead, it felt quiet. Justice wasn't about making them suffer. It was about refusing to carry the weight of their choices any longer. Once I understood that, I felt lighter than I had in years. I wasn't walking away because I hated them. I was walking away because I had finally learned to choose myself. Several months passed before everything finally settled down. The repairs were finished, the paperwork was complete, and the last of the unopened boxes had been unpacked. On a quiet Saturday morning, I carried my final bag through the front door and placed it in the hallway. For the first time, the house didn't feel like a project or a dream. It finally felt like home. I took my time arranging every room. There was no rush and no pressure to impress anyone. Each picture on the wall, every chair, every lamp, and every book on the shelves had been chosen because I liked it. The house reflected my life instead of someone else's expectations. The neighborhood turned out to be exactly what I had hoped for. My neighbors introduced themselves without asking personal questions or making assumptions about me. They welcomed me with simple kindness. One elderly couple even brought over homemade cookies on my first weekend. We spent an hour talking on the front porch, and when they left, I realized I had smiled more during that conversation than I had at most family gatherings. A few coworkers visited after I finished moving in. We ordered dinner, laughed about old office stories, and enjoyed the evening together. Nobody asked how much the house cost or suggested they deserved a part of it. They were simply happy to see me reaching a goal I had worked hard to achieve. Their support felt honest, and that made all the difference. Every now and then, I heard small updates about my relatives through other people. Some relationships between them never recovered after that night. I didn't ask for details, and I didn't feel curious anymore. Their problems were no longer mine to solve. One afternoon, I found the folder containing the security recordings and legal papers while organizing my home office. I looked at it for a few seconds before placing it inside a cabinet. I didn't need to watch those videos again. They had already served their purpose. Standing in the living room that evening, I looked through the large windows as the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. The house was quiet except for the sound of the wind outside. Months earlier, that same space had been filled with people who laughed at me without knowing whose home they had entered. Now it was peaceful. I finally understood something I had spent years trying to learn. Real happiness doesn't come from proving people wrong. It comes from building a life that no longer depends on their opinion. My family believed they had taken nothing more than one night inside an empty house. They never realized that night also marked the moment I stopped chasing their acceptance forever. I locked the front door, turned off the lights downstairs, and walked toward my bedroom with a calm heart. That house had given me more than a place to live. It had given me the freedom to begin the rest of my life on my own terms.